They came for the discarded ones first. That was the detail that haunted Kenji Mori for years afterward. Not the ships. Not the lights over the harbor. Not the moment the feeds went dark across 3 continents. What haunted him was that they started with the people nobody was looking for. The ones who had already disappeared. The ones the world had filed under acceptable losses. He'd been one of them. The debt had started small. A medical bill for his mother, then a loan to cover it, then another loan to cover the interest. By the time the original creditors sold his file to a collection outfit called Oishi Management, Kenji owed the equivalent of 11 years of his salary to men who showed up at his apartment door in groups of 3. He'd stopped answering his phone, stopped going to work, eaten convenience store onigiri for 6 weeks straight, and told himself it was temporary. All of it was temporary. The man in the orange coveralls found him at the train station at 2 in the morning, sitting on a bench with his last train pass and nowhere to go. The man's name was Sugihara, or at least that was what he said. And he had the particular smoothness of someone who had refined their pitch through 1,000 repetitions. "You look like a man who needs a fresh start," Sugihara said. Kenji said nothing. Sugihara sat down beside him anyway. "I represent an organization, a community really. We have a place outside the city, very private, where people like yourself can start over. Food, housing, medical care, entertainment, everything provided. All we ask is that you show up where we tell you, when we tell you. Small tasks, nothing strenuous. Kind of tasks, head counts. You show up, you get counted, you go home. Sometimes you hold a sign, sometimes you applaud. Sometimes you just eat at a restaurant on opening day so the place looks busy. You are the background, the context. You are the proof that something is real." Kenji had been too tired and too cold to feel suspicious. He'd followed Sugihara to a white van and woken up in a dormitory complex, in what turned out to be the high-altitude flatlands 300 kilometers north of anywhere he'd ever been. The place was called formally District 7. Everyone who lived there called it the town. That was 7 months before first contact. The Veth arrived in a way that was almost polite. No invasion fleet, no orbital bombardment, no harvest ships with mining arrays chewing through the upper atmosphere. They announced themselves with a signal, a precise electromagnetic pulse shaped like a handshake. And then a single craft, 12 kilometers across, settled itself over the Pacific at an altitude of 80,000 meters and waited. Waited 11 days, in fact, while humanity's governments argued over protocol, jurisdiction, translation software, and who exactly was authorized to respond. The Veth, turned out, were extraordinarily patient. They were also extraordinarily bureaucratic. They had a process. Everything about them was process. The translation came on day 12. Not from the Veth directly. They sent it through an intermediary signal that automated systems decoded over. Approximately 6 hours. And what it said, stripped of the formalities that made up most of the document, was this: we're a census civilization. They catalogued inhabited worlds. They required, for the purposes of their registry, certain data points that humanity had so far not provided in verifiable form: population, resource distribution, behavioral compliance clusters. They were not here to conquer. They were here to count. In the meantime, they would be establishing processing centers. Processing centers were the problem. They appeared overnight, on the 7th day after the translation, in 17 locations across 5 continents. Circular structures, 600 meters in diameter, assembled by automated drones while satellites tracked the build in real time, and every government on Earth watched its monitors and did not fire. "They looked," said one analyst on a major broadcast network, "like the world's largest manhole covers. Each one emitted a low vibration, not painful, barely perceptible, that left people within 3 kilometers reporting a mild, persistent disorientation. Like standing in a supermarket, trying to remember what you came in for, but all day, every day forever." The Veth themselves were not visible. They communicated only through the signal. The signal said, "Approach the processing centers. Be counted. Be verified. The process is mandatory. Compliance ensures continued access to resources." Continued access to resources. That was how an alien civilization, without deploying a single weapon, convinced a significant portion of the human population to line up voluntarily. Kenji was standing in the town's cafeteria. When the message came through on the common room screen, he watched with the others. Maybe 200 people, all of them residents, all of them in the same situation he was in. As the translated text scrolled past, nobody spoke for a long time. Then Sugihara walked in, still in his orange coveralls, and said, "We're going to need everyone to report to the Eastern Staging Area at 0600 tomorrow for an off-site assignment." Kenji said, "Is this connected to what just happened?" "It's connected to our operational mandate," Sugihara said. "Is the same as it always was." It was the first time Kenji wondered who was on the other end of the organization's leash. There was a woman named Hannah who had arrived at the town 3 weeks before Kenji. She'd come from a different entry point, collected somewhere in the Kansai region, but the architecture of her story was the same: abusive ex-husband, a restraining order that didn't restrain much, a network of mutual friends who were mostly his friends. She disappeared willingly because disappearing was better than the alternative. She was one of the few people in the town who seemed genuinely curious about the machinery of it, rather than just grateful to be consuming its outputs. She'd mapped the dormitory complex in her second week there. She knew which buildings were administrative, which ones had external communication arrays, and which ones had locked sub-basements that the staff declined to explain. "You know what they use us for," she said to Kenji one evening, over instant coffee in plastic cups. It wasn't a question. "I've been a pedestrian on a street that was being photographed for a real estate advertisement," Kenji said. "I've sat in a courtroom audience for what they told us was a civil dispute. I've applauded at 3 ribbon cuttings. Political rallies," Hana said. "I've been background at 2, and last month they drove a group of us to a protest and had us hold pre-printed signs. I didn't read mine until we were already there." She paused. "Somebody in this organization is renting us as consensus, seeing our bodies as proof that opinions exist, that crowds are real. It's not new," she said. "It's how a lot of things work. Just the visible part of it." She looked at the screen on the cafeteria wall, which was still showing the Veth signal translation on loop. Now imagine what an alien census bureau would pay for that service. Kenji sat with that for a long time. The processing center in their region was 4 hours north by transport van. The staff told them nothing specific. 42 residents were loaded up before dawn, issued blue plastic wristbands with barcodes, and told to follow the yellow markers when they arrived. The center, up close, was nothing like what the news footage had suggested. The news footage showed something sterile and architectural. Kenji stood in front of was a living surface. The exterior of the structure was covered in a material that moved like oil in water, slow and iridescent, constantly reconfiguring itself into patterns that the eye kept trying to read as language and failing. The vibration he'd been warned about was real. It settled in his molars and behind his eyes. Yellow markers on the ground led toward an entry corridor. Residents ahead of him were walking in and not immediately coming out the other side. The staff, Sugihara among them, hung back at the perimeter. Kenji stopped walking. He stopped walking and looked back, and Sugihara met his eyes with an expression that was professionally neutral, carefully non-reassuring, and Kenji understood in that moment, with the specific clarity that comes from being processed one time too many, that he was about to be catalogued. Not counted, catalogued. There was a difference, and the difference was whether you had a say in what category they put you in. He stepped sideways out of the queue. The person behind him shuffled forward to fill his slot without looking up. "Mori," Sugihara's voice clipped. "Back in line." No, it was such a small word. He'd said it so rarely in recent years that it felt strange in his mouth, the way an unfamiliar language feels. Recognizable, technically available, but requiring effort. "This is a mandatory assignment." "Mandatory for who?" Kenji said. "For you or for them?" He looked up at the processing center, at the oily moving surface of it, and then back at Sugihara. "What are they counting us for?" he said. "What are they building with our numbers?" Sugihara's expression didn't change. That was the answer. Hana had been watching from the back of the group. She hadn't moved toward the queue at all. Kenji realized, looking at her, she'd been waiting. She had a bag she hadn't carried on the van. He didn't ask where it had come from. There were 9 others who didn't go in. They ended up in a loose cluster near one of the transport vans, and the staff handled it the way all compliant systems handle non-compliance. They recorded it, noted it, and moved on to processing the ones who were still cooperative, because the math still worked. 32 minus 10 was 32. 32 was still a respectable number for an invoice. The 10 of them stood in the cold air at the processing center's perimeter and watched the structure pulse with its slow internal light. "They're not going to let us back in," said a man named Fukuda, who had been in the town for almost 2 years and was, Kenji suspected, person Hana had been talking to before this morning. He said it matter-of-factly, without accusation. "No," Hana agreed. "I found some things in the administrative building. Files, the organization's actual client records." She unzipped the bag and removed a hard drive that she'd clearly liberated without authorization. "They're not renting us to human clients. They haven't been for 3 weeks. Everything since first contact has been billed to a single account. The payer's designation translates roughly, VETH Population Compliance Bureau." Nobody spoke for a moment. "They sold us," Kenji said. "They were always in that business," Hana said. "The clientele just got bigger." What followed was not a heroic escape. There was no chase, no dramatic sprint across open ground. The staff at the processing center was more concerned with their quota than with 10 residents who had wandered to the edge of the perimeter. And the VETH's automated systems had not been calibrated for human noncompliance at that particular scale. 9 people out of 42 was 17% deviation, which fell below the threshold their algorithms flagged as significant. That was the first thing. The VETH had a threshold for what they considered meaningful resistance. Kenji and Hana, walking north along a secondary road in the gray morning light, with 8 others who were mostly quiet and mostly scared, were below that threshold. They were statistical noise, too small to process. He kept thinking about that. The second processing center attempt came 11 days later, in a different region, and this time the deviation rate was 31%. 19 people out of 61. The VETH systems flagged it. The organizational response was swift. The holdouts were collected and transported to what the staff called, without any apparent irony, a reorientation facility. Kenji heard from Fukuda, who had a radio and a contact in the organization's logistics network, who was getting increasingly nervous about what their client relationship was becoming. "The reorientation facility," the contact said, "was not a place where you reoriented and then went back to your regular life. It was a place where the VETH's drones performed what the translated documentation called compliance indexing. Nobody who'd gone through compliance indexing had come back with the same face. Not physically. Physically, they were untouched. It was something else. Something in the eyes, in the quality of their attention. They answered questions without hesitation. They followed yellow markers without pausing. They stood in queues with the patient, emptied stillness of people who had simply stopped weighing options. "It's not brainwashing," Hana said, reading the translated documentation on Fukuda's tablet, in a farmhouse outside a town that had emptied out when the nearby processing center was established. "Brainwashing implies rewriting. This is more like compression. They compress the part that argues, that wonders, says, 'But what if I don't?'" She looked up. "That's what they can't catalog. The what if I don't? Then that's what we have to keep," Kenji said. He'd spent enough time in the town to understand the mechanics of manufactured consensus. He'd been rented as a body in a crowd enough times to know how thin the evidence of agreement really was. How easily a dozen people in the right place and the right attitude could convince observers that 100 people held a belief, and how easily 100 could substitute for 1,000 in the right camera angle. The VETH were a census civilization. They catalogued worlds for a reason, for resource allocation, for decision trees, for the vast administrative machinery that apparently governed an interstellar bureaucracy. They needed numbers. Verified, cross-referenced, compliance-indexed numbers. The numbers had to add up. That was the pressure point. What they built was not an army. Kenji was very clear about this when he explained it to the 8 people who were still with him, in that farmhouse, eating canned food and listening to the VETH signal cycling through its daily compliance announcement on Fukuda's radio. "We're not going to fight them," he said. "We're not equipped for it, and it's not the right problem. The right problem is that they're counting on us to be countable." He'd spent his adult life being rented as a number, being placed in rooms and queues and rallies to make things look real that weren't. He understood, at a level that most people didn't need to understand because they'd never needed it, that numbers could be made to lie. 17% didn't flag their system, he said. 31 did. "What happens at 60, at 80? "We don't have 60 people," someone said. "Not yet." The people who were living in the ghost towns around the processing centers weren't town residents. They were just people. Farmers who hadn't left. Elderly couples who didn't have anywhere to go. Families who'd decided, for reasons that were various and individual and completely human, that this was their place and they were staying in it. Kenji talked to them. He was good at this. He had always been good at talking to people who felt like they didn't matter. Because he was one of them. He didn't promise safety. He didn't promise victory. He said, "There is a thing we can do. It requires only that you be exactly where you are, which you already are. It requires only that you say, when the time comes, that you counted yourself first." By the end of the second week, he had 43 people. By the end of the third, he had, by his rough count, 216, not soldiers, not a movement, people. Farmers and former salary workers and retired teachers and people who had wandered away from the town just as he had, reasons that were various and individual and completely human. Hannah organized them into cells of 12, because 12 was the number below which the Veth's flagging algorithm apparently didn't bother. She had an engineer's mind under the quiet surface of her. She read the translated documentation the way Kenji had never been able to read anything. Its assumptions, for the gaps between what it said and what it meant, places where the logic of one system ran up against the logic of another. "They're counting compliance events," she told him one night, working by the light of a small electric lantern. "Not people. Every time someone goes through a processing center, that's one compliance event. They don't track individual humans across events. The data architecture isn't built for longitudinal individual tracking. They're building a census of behaviors, not identities." Kenji stared at her. "Say that again." "They know how many times the behavior occurred. They don't know if the same person did it twice." She looked up at him. "Or if 12 different people each did it once when they were expecting one." The day of the action, Kenji wore the orange coveralls. He'd taken them from the locker at the back of the farmhouse, the ones left by a former town staff member who'd joined them after his third week of being paid in Veth processing credits, and deciding that payment was insufficient. They were slightly too large. He didn't care. He stood at the entry to the processing center that had been established 40 kilometers from the farmhouse in the parking lot of a former agricultural depot, and he waited. The compliance announcement was playing. The yellow markers were lit. The Veth's drone sensors were active, scanning the approach zone. He pressed the modified transmitter Hana had built. Its signal, she'd assured him, exactly like the organization's logistics check-in code. And 112 people walked into view from 4 different directions. They were all wearing orange. They approached the processing center in compliance formation. Hana had drilled the exact body language, the exact pace, the exact orientation that the drone sensors read as cooperative, and they walked through the exterior scan zone in groups of 12, and each group registered on the Veth systems as a compliance event. And then they walked around the back of the structure, and out of sensor range, reformed and walked through again. 3 passes, each group of 12 registering 3 times. 112 people, generating 336 compliance events. Meanwhile, the actual processing corridor received no one. The Veth systems, Hana had explained, were designed to maximize throughput and minimize exceptions. When intake events exceeded corridor processing capacity, the system didn't flag non-compliance. It flagged processing backlog. It generated a queue management alert. It assumed the problem was on its own side. What it reported, upward through whatever vast administrative structure it fed data to, was, "This region is showing unexpectedly high compliance. allocate additional processing resources. The algorithm, in other words, told its operators that something was working well. Kenji did the walk 4 times in rotation with the others, because he wanted to know what it felt like up close. The oily surface of the structure, the vibration in his molars, the yellow markers under his feet. He looked at the entry corridor and thought about all the people he'd been background for over the past 7 months. The civil dispute, the ribbon cuttings, the political rally where he'd held a sign he hadn't read. All the times he'd been rented as proof that something was real. He thought about his mother's medical bill, which still technically existed somewhere in a database he'd never be able to fully clear. On his 4th pass, he was walking next to an old farmer named Tachibana, who had refused to leave his land when the processing center appeared and had spent the 3 weeks since in a state of calm, practical fury. Tachibana had brought his own orange fabric, which his wife had sewn into a coverall that fit him perfectly. "My grandfather worked for the government survey office," Tachibana said, keeping his pace steady and his eyes forward. He counted rice fields. He said the most important thing he ever learned was that the number you port is never the same as the number you found. "What does that mean?" Kenji said. "Shh. It means the ones doing the counting always have a reason for the count. And the ones being counted always have a reason for the number they offer." Tachibana glanced sideways at him. "This has been true since before the Veth. It will be true after." The disruption took 11 days to propagate through the Veth's regional data network. Hannah tracked it through a monitoring system she'd built from the organization's repurposed communication hardware. What they saw was an anomaly alert, suppressed by the backlog management subroutine. A resource allocation adjustment sent 2 additional processing drones to the depot center, where they found nominal activity and no queue. A second anomaly alert conflicted with the first. A data integrity flag, which queried the compliance numbers against the corridor intake logs and found a significant discrepancy. Then the Veth's signal changed. The daily compliance announcement went silent. For 14 hours, nothing came from the craft at 80,000 meters. Then a new transmission, longer and more complex than anything they'd received before. It took Hana's translation software 3 days to process it fully. What it said, in the parts they could understand, was data inconsistency detected in regional compliance records, investigation required, processing suspended pending audit, and then, in a clause near the end that Kenji read 3 times to make sure he was understanding it correctly, categorization of this population node as non-standard. Standard census protocols inapplicable. "What does that mean?" Fukuda said, standing in the farmhouse with the translation on the screen. "It means we broke their model," Hana said. "Their census assumes populations that want to be counted, that seek the compliance event, generated the compliance signature without the compliance." She paused. "They don't have a category for that. The behavior doesn't fit the data architecture." "So what do they do with a population that doesn't fit their architecture?" "They have to write a new one," Kenji said. "And to write a new one they have to understand us. And to understand us," he stopped at the translation again. The word recategorization. "They have to ask us." The first formal Veth communication directed specifically at human representatives. Not a broadcast signal, not a general compliance announcement, but a targeted query addressed to what their systems had identified as the anomaly's origin point. Was the depot center in Fukuda's region. Arrived 6 days later. It requested, in the precise and somewhat chilling language of bureaucratic civilization, a meeting. Kenji went in the orange coveralls. He brought Hana and Tachibana and a young woman named Mitsuki who had been a linguistics student before she'd followed an ex-boyfriend into a debt spiral and ended up in the town, and who had spent the 11 days of disruption building a secondary translation system that ran parallel to Hana's, and caught 17 significant ambiguities in the original documents that had previously gone unresolved. The Veth representative, there was only one, a designation rather than a body, a towering armature of articulated machinery that moved with the deliberate weight of something that had decided long ago to be unrushed. communicated through a speaker array that translated in real time, its voice a constructed approximation of language that landed in Kenji's ears as slightly too regular, the words correctly spaced, the inflection absent, it said. The anomaly in your region has been noted. Compliance events do not correspond to corridor processing records. This is an error in our system, or an error in your behavior, Kenji said. It's neither, it's a third thing. A pause. The armature's sensor array oriented toward him. We showed up, Kenji said, formed the required external behavior. We did not permit the internal processing. Those are two different things. Your system only measured one of them. The purpose of the process is the internal processing. I know, but you built your count around the assumption that we would comply with both stages, just because we complied with the first. He kept his voice. He was thinking about Sugihara, about all the times he'd been rented as evidence of things that weren't real. He was thinking about his mother's bill, about the old farmer's grandfather counting rice fields. You can't have a census of a population that counts itself. We'll always know more about our own numbers than you do. The armature stood very still. Its sensor array moved slowly from Kenji to Hana to Tachibana to Mitsuki and back. Then it said, "What do you want?" 3 words. An alien census civilization. Managing an interstellar administrative framework of incomprehensible scale and precision, with a ship 12 kilometers wide parked over the Pacific Ocean, asking what they wanted. Kenji thought about it for a moment. Not long. "Count ourselves," he said. "We'll give you numbers. We'll verify them through our own systems. But we do the counting, and we control what gets counted." The negotiation took 4 months. Mitsuki did most of the translation work. Hana built the secure communication system, and in the process, developed 2 frameworks for interspecies data verification that she later published, and that became the foundation for what eventually got called the Kashima Protocols. Tachibana went home to his farm. His wife had kept everything running while he was away. He sent Kenji a crate of rice the following autumn. The compliance announcements stopped. Processing centers were dismantled. Methodically, without drama, the structures disassembling themselves into their component drones and lifting, away in the night. The depot center's parking lot went back to being a parking lot, with a faint circular indentation in the asphalt that Fukuda later covered with a portable basketball hoop. Kenji's debt was not forgiven. Nobody swept in to cancel it. He spent the better part of the next 3 years working through it in the ordinary way, slowly and sometimes exhaustingly, and with occasional stretches of eating cheap food and sleeping somewhere he'd rather not be sleeping. He came out of it as himself. That was the part that mattered. He'd decided, standing in front of that processing center in orange coveralls, who he was after this would be determined by what he did inside it, not what was done to him in it. The counting would go one way and not the other. The VETH, as far as anyone could tell, added a notation to their registry. It said, fully translated, "This population exhibits non-standard census behavior. Compliance architecture requires revision. See Kashima Protocols. See Contact Records. Human Representative K. Mori." At the bottom of the notation, in what Mitsuki said was the VETH's administrative equivalent of a marginal comment. The kind of thing a civil servant leaves in a file to warn the next one. There were 3 additional characters that she translated as, "Do not attempt standard processing. They count themselves."